just introduce my topic of research once again. My PhD focuses on the intersections of gender and sexuality with diaspora, class, and caste, and the articulation of these modalities in the films of Shyama Prasad. So something quite curious, something which Venkata was talking about as well, about the lack of resources, the lack of vernacular resources, the lack of material, film-related material, especially within pertaining to the local. I think one of the things I noticed was even when I asked Shyama Prasad for his films in English, with the English subtitles, he gave me a list of films, but there was still a set of films which even he couldn't provide me. He said there's still no copies of some of his films or material on some of films. And research on his films, there was hardly any research on his films done before this. So any sort of big quality peer-reviewed academic sources that I could find before I started my research, and even at this stage. And I would locate him probably, as Venkateshwaran said, as sort of director who falls in the crossover between art and commercial. Cultural studies focus on such kind of directors. One of the other things that both speakers, Venkateshwaran and Ratish, talked about is the how to converse the theoretical to reach the global. I think one probably not a solution to that, but one way of thinking about it. But I would like to hear your responses, both of your responses to that, is probably to integrate. I'm not suggesting a solution for it to solve it fully, but in a way to integrate the two, in a way how you could use concepts that generate from the local, like for instance, or the vernacular, like in Malayalam, if you say a concept like manam or Taravada or Andajanam, and all that in conversation with global theoretical concepts like Foucault or Doreen Massey or Agamben, and so ways in which the Malayali social norms could converse with the Western theory and giving birth to good radical voices, rather than refusing to see them as either or. So that's one way of dealing with it. I would love to hear your opinion about that too. Another thing is about, we talked about cultural studies. I'll talk a lot more about cultural studies in my talk, but I deal a lot of cultural studies, deal with a lot of cultural studies in my work as well. But I think one of the things we should talk about cultural studies, especially in the current era, is about the emergence of the digital and what cultural studies does. Of course, cultural studies is going through a renaissance due to the emergence of the digital. Concepts like ideology or interpellation and surveillance and everything coming to the forefront. I think not just with the media studies side of cultural studies, but even OTT platforms and all that. So I think there is something to talk about that as well. Lack of local writing, vernacular writing. I think cultural studies also has been facing that sort of crisis since long, I would say. I think Dipesh Chakravarti, a subaltern scholar, writes about it, about provincializing cultural studies. And both of you talking about feminist writing, and it's important. So the ways to tackle it, the ways to go about feminist writing. I think the feminist writing is still very relevant topic, or in terms of its scope, as a way of calling out, as other ways of looking at non-normative representations, non-heteronormative ways of critical work, one of which is intersectionality, which I deal with in my work, which I will talk about in more detail. The thing about religion, which Venkati spoke about, religion is communal, the use of icons or symbols, and how that is seen as communal. I quite agree to it, although I would rather say the depiction of these symbols or icons alone may not necessarily make it communal. It is probably the politicization of such images or signs that makes within a representative, in terms of representation, that makes it purely communal. The question of caste, which Venkati mentioned, is very relevant. Although I find there are, I guess, a few articles about just not a lot, but very few articles talks about Dalit communities, or how it's dealt with in Malayalam cinema, but not a lot along those lines. But certainly, when I looked at the whole set of articles that come under representation of caste in Malayalam cinema, I feel there's certainly a lack on certainly there is sort of a huge number of articles coming out on the representation of the lower caste, and less focus on the hegemonic status of the upper caste. I think that's important as well, particularly the Brahmins, because there is material on the Brahmin community. Scholars like Patel has been writing about it for long, but in terms of its representation in films, I think something which we need to look at in detail. I tried to do a bit of that in my research, especially looking at the way it evolves from historical privilege and meritocracy. It's important to give emphasis to a structural critique that does not merely reproduce those essential or essentialized images of the lower caste, especially from an intersectional point of view. I think it's equally significant to examine how it could be like how caste is gendered, or how class and caste or gender all work together, or it creates a system where women in particular are constantly oppressed and marginalized in the society. I think this approach is crucial to question the values and norms of the upper caste particularly in the neoliberal, consumer-driven, patriarchal Kerala society, who deny caste and gender equality and claim to be modern and casteless subjects. I think Satish Deshpande writes about this as well, about casteless subjects. Film studies as part of literature department or literary studies is something which we've been seeing especially in the context, and I've been talking about a bit about it, not a lot, but then a quote from Megan Morris, the great Megan Morris, probably a bit in response to that as well. Yeah, in light of what Venkateshwaran spoke and Ratish spoke, I think you can't deny that it's quite important to view, of course, film studies, but then it's important to view cultural studies as a critical response to kind of sexist, casteist, classist discourses. And before I briefly talk about certain aspects about my work, I would like to look back to a question Professor Narayanan raised in this lecture, in the second lecture of the series. And I use it as a way to enter into a conversation about my research and the sort of conceptual theoretical tools, ideas that I employ. He had asked then, has cultural studies become just theory-based and not reacting to actual political problems in the society? This I felt is a great inquiry. Later, he also noted that cultural studies research cannot be limited to a local phenomenon. I think what Narayan Mash kind of proposed is a study that is deeply concerned with the local, but not necessarily embedded in the local. I presume the key here could be to work with the various concepts and frameworks that would be useful to situate the local and engage with the local, but be translocal. And I talk about this here because I feel translocality can be a very useful idea, especially one adopts something like an intersectional analysis as a key theoretical framework to analyze social issues, as I do in my research. Intersectionality works within the logic of cultural studies, as in it is anti-reductionist, does not reduce complex power structures into a single division such as caste or class, and sees these modalities as mutually constituted. And as we discuss intersectionality and translocality, the idea of space or spaces cannot be neglected. Something which I think the idea of space, something which I use quite significantly in my research. How does power play out or negotiated in different spaces or meanings, or what meanings does it assume as it travels spaces? These questions, I think, becomes quite important. In my research, I employ the concept of space, because we have scholars like Joy Massey or Deserto or Foucault or Soja, all of whom have mobilized it in different ways to understand the role of spatial dimensions in the exercise of power. For instance, how can we think about Foucault's idea of disciplinary spaces to analyze the middle class, talking about the Indian middle class or the Kerala middle class, or the way in which the Nambudiri Ilams operate, Of course, you need to consider temporality too there when you're talking about the numbers. Of course, post-colonial needs to be brought into context. Or what happens when characters in the films transgress these spaces, or these films, or any films for that matter. How are spaces related to the fluidity of identities, or the specific ways in which identities are performed? And in my work, I kind of situate cultural studies as a method that contextualizes the complex social, economic, political, cultural, ideological trajectories that formulate the everyday and explore these relations of power and these discursive formations of difference in very specific conjunctural conditions. I think that sort of context is framed to make sense of what is going on in the film. So I turn to cultural studies to critically locate the films of Shyama Prasad within the wider socio-political milieu of Kerala society. So while I look at Kerala society, especially post-liberalization, I also investigate the representational politics of gender in Malayalam cinema, because one in relation to the other, and examine intersectionality as the key theoretical framework to investigate how gender intersects with other modalities such as diaspora, caste, class in the films. I think as I talked about caste early on, very little material on class in the Kerala context or diaspora. I think Ratish has written a lot on the diaspora, but apart from that, I would say, particularly in relation to Malayalam cinema, I wouldn't say there is a lot out there. I thought it was important to address the conjuncture and to understand the relationality of specific context to the formations. Now, what did cultural studies enable me to do? At the beginning stages of my thesis, I did consider auteur theory in what would be a pure film studies sort of approach, which Venkati talked about. Whereas he points out in his talk, the focus would be entirely on the director as the auteur and specific styles, patterns of filmmaking, and more emphasis on form and style over meaning. However, I was unable to locate Shyama Prasad into that frame among notable auteurs such as Tarantino, Hitchcock, Wes Anderson, and so on. I'm not talking about a comparison here, but for saying is any less or more. But there could be a whole list of possible filmmakers that you come up with, but all of whom had a very unique visual style that would qualify them as auteurs. Another thing that I asked myself was whether I will do justice to my research if I just look at such visual cues of form, style, narrative elements in the analysis of films. Are there more than just these elements to explore? What about the social, political, economic, historical context of these films? When are these films made? What spaces do the characters occupy in these films? Why do they matter? I started to ask these questions. Cultural studies enable me to kind of rethink notions about particular forms of political struggle and transformation, the politics of everyday discourses, especially to reimagine them in particular ways, or what Megan Morris conceives as the relations between the politics of culture and the politics of politics. I think Lawrence Grossberg also talks about this. But it's quite interesting how Megan, when I last saw her in a conference a couple of years ago, cultural studies conference, she made this, gave this definition of cultural studies. One of the ways she conceived it was, she said, cultural studies looks at the relationship between what is understood as culture or practiced as culture in a particular local and things within that local, which is not cultural, like social, economic, political. So that relationship of that with things that are not cultural, which is like social, economic, political, moral, and so on. And about specific ways of doing cultural studies. Also in cultural studies, I think one does not assume the possibility of a precise theory that can fit in perfectly, or a single theoretical application that can provide all the answers in advance. It can draw on multiple theoretical frameworks, research methods, and does not have a fixed political agenda or an object of study. What is in fact most important thing to cultural studies is context, as Professor Satish mentioned it in the first lecture of the series. I still remember about the importance of context, I think in response to Rajan Gurukul's talk, or we could term it as radical contextuality, to borrow from Grossberg. I think cultural studies research is carried out through this contextually and historically specific analysis of the different ways in which power and how these social-cultural relationships are formed and maintained. We know they are also structured in specific ways. Just before I finish, to quote Megan again, I'm a huge fan of her writing, so apologies for quoting her again and again. But on the specificity of cultural studies, because we have already many discussions in this forum on what constitutes a cultural studies approach and what does not. And I think that's central to the objectives of this webinar series. So this is what she says: cultural studies may work as a space where disciplines talk to each other, question each other, trend on each other's toes, with a view to redefine. And this is also in response to what Venkateshwaran said about cultural studies being a part of the literature department or literary studies. So she says cultural studies may work as a space where disciplines talk to each other, question each other, trend on each other's toes, with a view to redefining a shared, if not common, sense of purpose. A literary reading of a shopping mall that does not seriously engage with questions that arise in history, sociology, and economics remains, however productive a transformation of the canon of English it may be, a literary reading, not cultural studies. So essentially what interests me as a cultural studies scholar is how it draws ideas and concepts from a broad range of disciplines, theoretical models, policies, methods. I think there's a complexity to it, a sort of ordered chaos, which brings out the real joy of conducting intellectual work. That's what I feel about it. Thank you.